The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Park as Princess Anne reviewed the morning's intelligence reports. Her personal secretary had delivered them with unusual urgency, and the contents made her jaw tighten with each passing line. The reports detailed a series of private conversations and meetings that painted a disturbing picture of ambition and manipulation within the royal circle. Tom Parker Bowles had been busy. The food critic and son of Queen had been hosting discreet dinner parties at his London home, gatherings that appeared innocent on the surface but carried undertones of something far more calculated. According to the security briefings, these weren't casual social events, but carefully orchestrated meetings with influential figures from media, politics, and the aristocracy. Princess Anne had always prided herself on her direct approach to problems. Unlike other members of the royal family who preferred diplomatic solutions, she believed in addressing issues head-on. The reports suggested that Tom had been subtly questioning Prince George's future role, planting seeds of doubt about the young prince's readiness to eventually inherit the throne. More concerning were the whispered suggestions that perhaps the line of succession needed to be reconsidered for the modern age. The Princess Royal understood the gravity of what she was reading. These weren't idle gossip or harmless speculation. The conversations detailed in the reports showed a pattern of behavior that could potentially destabilize the carefully maintained order of succession. Tom had been suggesting to his dinner guests that Prince George, still a young boy, might benefit from a different path in life, one that didn't burden him with the weight of future kingship. Anne's phone buzzed with a message from her brother, King Charles. He had received similar reports and wanted to discuss the matter privately. The king's message was brief, but carried an undercurrent of concern that Anne recognized immediately. Charles had always been protective of his grandson, and any threat to George's position would not be taken lightly. The intelligence reports revealed that Tom's campaign wasn't random or spontaneous. He had been methodical in his approach, carefully selecting guests who held influence in various spheres of British society. Journalists known for their royal coverage, members of parliament with Republican leanings, and even some distant members of the aristocracy had all been present at these gatherings. What made the situation particularly delicate was Tom's position as the Queen Consort's son. Any action taken against him would inevitably involve, creating a potential rift within the royal family at a time when unity was essential. Anne knew that her stepmother had worked hard to establish her place within the royal hierarchy, and this situation threatened to undermine those efforts. The reports also mentioned private meetings between Tom and certain media figures, discussions that apparently centered on the concept of modernizing the monarchy. While modernization wasn't inherently problematic, the specific nature of these conversations suggested that Tom was advocating for changes that would directly affect the line of succession. Anne poured herself a cup of tea and considered her options. She could approach the matter diplomatically, perhaps having a quiet word with first. Alternatively, she could address Tom directly, making it clear that his activities had been noticed and were unwelcome. The third option, and perhaps the most decisive, would be to recommend immediate sanctions through official channels. The Princess Royal had always been known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties. She had earned respect through decades of dedicated service, and her word carried significant weight within the family. Unlike some of her relatives, Anne had never been involved in scandals or controversies that might undermine her authority. As she read through the final pages of the report, Anne's expression grew increasingly stern. The intelligence suggested that Tom's efforts were gaining traction among certain circles. Some media outlets had begun publishing articles questioning the traditional approach to royal succession, and there were hints that these pieces might have been influenced by Tom's private advocacy. The rain continued to fall as Anne made her decision. The protection of Prince George's future role wasn't just a matter of family loyalty. It was about preserving the constitutional foundation upon which the monarchy rested. Any attempt to undermine the established line of succession, regardless of the motivation behind it, represented a threat that demanded immediate action. She reached for her secure phone to place a call to Palace. The conversation would be difficult, but Anne had never shied away from difficult conversations when the interests of the crown were at stake. The reports would be forwarded to the appropriate officials, and recommendations for sanctions would be made within the hour. The intelligence had been thorough and damaging. Tom's activities weren't just inappropriate, they bordered on seditious in their potential impact on the constitutional order. Anne knew that swift action would be necessary to prevent the situation from escalating further. The young Prince George's future depended on the adults around him, maintaining the stability and security of his eventual inheritance. As she prepared to make the call that would set serious consequences in motion, Anne reflected on the responsibilities that came with royal privilege. Tom had enjoyed the benefits of his connection to the royal family, but he had apparently forgotten that those benefits came with obligations and constraints that could not be ignored. The emergency meeting convened in the king's private study at Clarence House, away from the prying eyes of staff and media. King Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, while Princess Anne occupied the leather chair across from him. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension as they reviewed the evidence that had been compiled against Tom Parker Bowles. Anne had arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to organize her thoughts and prepare for what would undoubtedly be a challenging conversation. The king appeared tired, the weight of the situation evident in the lines around his eyes. This wasn't just a family matter. It was a constitutional crisis in the making, and both siblings understood the implications. The evidence was more extensive than initially reported. Palace security had been monitoring Tom's activities for several weeks, following up on suspicious communications that had been flagged by their intelligence network. What they discovered was a coordinated effort that went beyond casual dinner party conversations. Tom had been in contact with Republican activists, individuals who openly advocated for the abolition of the monarchy. While such contacts weren't illegal, they were highly inappropriate for someone in his position. More troubling were the financial records that showed payments to Tom from various media organizations, suggesting that his anti-George campaign might have been financially motivated. Charles rubbed his temples as Anne presented the full scope of the investigation. The king had hoped that the initial reports were exaggerated or misunderstood, but the additional evidence painted an unmistakable picture of deliberate action against Prince George's future role. Tom had been methodically building a case against the young prince's suitability for future kingship. The most damaging evidence came from recorded conversations obtained through legitimate security channels. In these recordings, Tom could be heard explicitly discussing strategies for undermining public confidence in Prince George. He had suggested that the prince was too sheltered, too removed from common experience to effectively serve as a future monarch. Anne's voice remained steady as she outlined the severity of the situation. Tom's actions weren't just inappropriate family behavior. They constituted a direct challenge to the constitutional order. The monarchy's stability depended on the clear and unquestioned line of succession, and any attempt to manipulate public opinion against the heir presumptive was unacceptable. The king listened in silence as Anne detailed Tom's connections to various media figures. Several prominent journalists had been receiving information from Tom that they were using to craft articles questioning the traditional monarchy structure. While the articles appeared to be independent journalism, the evidence showed clear coordination with Tom's campaign. What made the situation particularly painful for Charles was the involvement of his wife's son. Had worked tirelessly to establish herself as a respected member of the royal family, and Tom's actions threatened to undermine everything she had accomplished. The king knew that any sanctions against Tom would inevitably affect his relationship with. Anne had anticipated this concern and had prepared recommendations that would minimize the impact on the queen consort while still addressing the threat to Prince George. The sanctions would be presented as necessary security measures rather than personal punishment, allowing to maintain some distance from her son's actions. The evidence also revealed that Tom had been in contact with certain members of Parliament who had expressed Republican sympathies. These politicians had been subtly incorporating Tom's talking points into their public statements about the monarchy. The coordination suggested a level of organization that went beyond individual initiative. Charles stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the garden while processing the information. The king had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but the evidence against Tom was overwhelming and undeniable. The threat to Prince George's future couldn't be ignored or minimized. Anne emphasized that time was critical. Tom's campaign was gaining momentum, and delaying action would only allow the damage to spread further. Public opinion could be influenced by sustained negative coverage, and once doubt was planted about Prince George's suitability, it would be difficult to completely eliminate. The Princess Royal had already consulted with constitutional experts who confirmed that the king had the authority to impose sanctions on individuals who posed a threat to the line of succession. These sanctions could include restrictions on public appearances, limitations on media access, and suspension of certain royal privileges that Tom had enjoyed through his mother's marriage. Charles returned to his desk and reviewed the formal recommendation that Anne had prepared. The sanctions were comprehensive but proportional to the threat posed. Tom would be barred from attending official royal events, his security detail would be withdrawn, and he would be prohibited from using his connection to the royal family for commercial purposes. The king's signature would make the sanctions official and immediate. Palace security would be within the hour, and Tom would be formally informed of the restrictions by the end of the day. The swift implementation was necessary to prevent any final attempts at sabotage before the sanctions took effect. Anne watched her brother carefully as he considered the decision. She knew that Charles preferred diplomatic solutions, but the evidence left no room for compromise. Tom's actions had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, regardless of family relationships or personal feelings. The king finally reached for his pen, pausing momentarily before signing the document. The sanctions against Tom Parker Bowles were now official, marking the beginning of serious consequences for his campaign against Prince George. The swift and decisive action would send a clear message that threats to the line of succession would not be tolerated. As Charles completed his signature, both siblings understood that this decision would have lasting implications for family relationships. However, their primary duty was to protect the constitutional order and ensure Prince George's rightful place in the line of succession remained secure. The formal notification arrived at Tom Parker Bowles' Chelsea residence at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, delivered by a senior palace official accompanied by 2 security personnel. Tom had been expecting some form of response to his recent activities, but the severity of the sanctions outlined in the document came as a shock that left him momentarily speechless. The official sanctions were comprehensive and immediate. Tom's royal protection detail was withdrawn effective immediately. His access to royal events was permanently revoked, and he was prohibited from using his connection to the royal family for any commercial or media purposes. Most significantly, he was banned from making any public statements regarding the line of succession or any member of the royal family. Tom's initial reaction was one of defiance mixed with disbelief. He had convinced himself that his campaign against Prince George was justified and necessary for the modernization of the monarchy. In his mind, he was performing a public service by questioning outdated traditions and highlighting the need for change in the royal succession system. The palace official who delivered the sanctions made it clear that these measures were final and non-negotiable. Any violation of the restrictions would result in additional legal consequences, including potential criminal charges for interfering with constitutional processes. The seriousness of the situation was emphasized through the formal language and legal implications outlined in the document. Word of the sanctions spread quickly through royal circles, creating ripple effects that reached far beyond Tom's immediate situation. Queen learned of her son's punishment through an urgent call from King Charles, a conversation that lasted nearly an hour and left both parties emotionally drained. The Queen consort found herself in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to her son and her duties to the crown. His response to the crisis revealed the depth of her commitment to her royal role. Despite her natural instinct to defend her son, she publicly supported the king's decision and distanced herself from Tom's activities. Her statement, released through palace channels, emphasized her complete support for Prince George and the established line of succession. The media reaction to the sanctions was immediate and intense. Royal correspondents who had been receiving information from Tom suddenly found themselves without their source, leading to speculation about the reasons behind his sudden disappearance from public events. The palace's official statement was carefully worded to maintain discretion while making clear that serious action had been taken. Tom's associates and contacts began distancing themselves from him as news of the sanctions became known within relevant circles. The journalists who had been incorporating his talking points into their articles quickly shifted their editorial positions, unwilling to risk their access to royal sources by continuing to promote Tom's agenda. The financial implications of the sanctions hit Tom particularly hard. His food-writing career had been significantly enhanced by his royal connections, and the prohibition on using his royal ties for commercial purposes effectively ended several lucrative contracts and opportunities. Publishers who had been interested in his projects suddenly became unavailable, and speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Princess Anne monitored the implementation of the sanctions personally, ensuring that every aspect was properly enforced. Her security contacts provided regular updates on Tom's activities, confirming that he was complying with the restrictions while clearly struggling with the dramatic change in his circumstances. The sanctions also affected Tom's social circle in unexpected ways. Many of the influential figures who had attended his dinner parties and supported his anti-George campaign began avoiding him entirely. The royal connection that had once made him an attractive host had transformed into a liability that people preferred to avoid. Queen faced her own challenges as the situation unfolded. Several long-standing friendships became strained as people questioned her knowledge of or involvement in her son's activities. Despite her public statements supporting the sanctions, some observers wondered whether she had been aware of Tom's campaign and had chosen not to intervene. The impact on Prince George himself was carefully managed by his parents and security detail. The young prince was shielded from the details of the situation, but additional security measures were implemented to ensure his continued safety and privacy. The king and queen made sure that George's daily routine remained as normal as possible despite the ongoing crisis. Tom's attempts to challenge the sanctions through legal channels proved unsuccessful. Constitutional lawyers consulted by his representatives confirmed that the king had acted within his authority and that the measures were legally sound. The sanctions were presented as necessary security precautions rather than punitive actions, making them difficult to contest legally. The enforcement of the sanctions sent a clear message throughout royal circles about the consequences of challenging the established order. Other individuals who might have been considering similar actions reconsidered their plans, understanding that the royal family was prepared to take decisive action to protect the line of succession. As weeks passed, Tom's isolation became more complete. Former friends and associates continued to distance themselves, and his attempts to rebuild his public profile were consistently blocked by the restrictions placed upon him. The man who had once enjoyed significant influence and access found himself effectively excluded from the circles he had once moved within freely. The sanctions also had a chilling effect on Republican activists and other critics of the monarchy. The swift and comprehensive response to Tom's activities demonstrated that the royal family was prepared to use all available tools to protect their constitutional position. This realization led to a noticeable decrease in public criticism of Prince George and the succession system. Princess Anne's role in orchestrating the sanctions enhanced her reputation as a defender of royal tradition and constitutional order. Her decisive action was praised within palace circles and strengthened her position as one of the most respected members of the royal family. The successful neutralization of the threat to Prince George her status as someone willing to take difficult but necessary action when royal interests were at stake. 6 months after the sanctions were implemented, the long-term consequences of Tom Parker Bowles' actions continued to reverberate through the royal family and British society. The swift and decisive response had effectively ended the immediate threat to Prince George's position, but the underlying tensions and relationships within the royal family had been permanently altered by the crisis. Tom's professional life had been devastated by the restrictions placed upon him. His food-writing career, once flourishing with the subtle boost provided by his royal connections, had withered as publishers and media outlets distanced themselves from him. The commercial prohibition meant he could no longer leverage his relationship to the royal family, eliminating what had been a significant advantage in his professional endeavors. The isolation had taken a personal toll as well. Tom found himself excluded from the social circles he had once moved within freely, as former friends and associates continued to avoid any connection that might compromise their own relationships with the royal establishment. The dinner parties that had once been the center of his influence campaign became impossible to organize as potential guests declined invitations. Queen had navigated the crisis with remarkable skill, managing to maintain her position within the royal family while dealing with the personal pain of her son's situation. Her public support for the sanctions and explicit backing of Prince George had demonstrated her loyalty to the crown, but privately she struggled with the complete severance of Tom's royal connections. The Queen Consort's relationship with Princess Anne had evolved during the crisis, developing into a grudging mutual respect. Anne's decisive action had been painful for personally, but she recognized that the Princess Royal had acted to protect the constitutional order rather than pursue a personal vendetta. This understanding had prevented the situation from creating a permanent rift within the family. King Charles had emerged from the crisis with his authority strengthened, having demonstrated that he was prepared to take difficult action when necessary to protect the monarchy. The sanctions had been his decision ultimately, and the successful resolution enhanced his reputation as a strong and decisive monarch willing to defend the institution he led. Prince George remained largely unaware of the details of the threat that had been neutralized on his behalf. His parents had successfully shielded him from the controversy while implementing additional security measures to ensure his continued safety. The young prince's daily life continued normally, allowing him to focus on his education and development without the burden of understanding the political machinations that had surrounded him. The media landscape had shifted significantly following Tom's removal from the influence network he had built. Journalists who had been receiving information and talking points from him were forced to develop new sources and approaches to royal coverage. The articles questioning Prince George's suitability for future kingship disappeared from publication schedules, replaced by more traditional royal coverage. Republican activists and other critics of the monarchy found their efforts significantly hampered by the demonstration of royal resolve. The swift action against Tom served as a warning that challenges to the constitutional order would be met with serious consequences. This chilling effect reduced the frequency and intensity of public criticism directed at the royal family. Princess Anne's reputation had been enhanced by her role in identifying and neutralizing the threat. Her decisive action and thorough investigation had prevented what could have become a serious constitutional crisis. Within royal circles, she was increasingly viewed as the family's most reliable defender, someone who could be counted upon to take necessary action regardless of personal relationships or political considerations. The intelligence network that had uncovered Tom's activities was quietly expanded and strengthened following the crisis. Palace security recognized that the threat had been more sophisticated than initially realized, and additional resources were allocated to monitoring potential future challenges to the royal family's stability. Tom's attempts at rehabilitation were consistently frustrated by the comprehensive nature of the sanctions. Every effort to rebuild his public profile or restore his professional standing encountered the barriers created by his prohibited status. The isolation was complete and appeared to be permanent, serving as a powerful deterrent to others who might consider similar actions. The crisis had also revealed vulnerabilities in the royal family's internal security that were subsequently addressed. The ease with which Tom had been able to build his influence network and coordinate his campaign highlighted the need for better monitoring of individuals with royal connections who might pose internal threats. Queen's children faced ongoing scrutiny as a result of Tom's actions, with increased attention paid to their activities and associations. While no evidence suggested that other family members had been involved in Tom's campaign, the enhanced monitoring served as both a security measure and a reminder of the consequences of inappropriate behavior. The constitutional experts who had advised on the sanctions praised the royal family's response as proportional and effective. The swift action had prevented a potential crisis from escalating, while demonstrating the monarchy's ability to defend itself against internal threats. The precedent set by the Tom Parker Bowles case would likely influence how future challenges would be addressed. Prince George's future security arrangements were permanently enhanced as a result of the threat assessment conducted during the crisis. Additional layers of protection were implemented to ensure that no similar campaign could develop undetected in the future. The young prince's position as future king was now more secure than ever, protected by the lessons learned from Tom's failed attempt to undermine his status. The royal family had weathered the crisis with their unity intact, despite the personal costs involved. The swift and decisive response had sent a clear message about their commitment to protecting the constitutional order and ensuring the stability of the succession. Princess Anne's leadership during the crisis had demonstrated that threats to the crown would be met with immediate and comprehensive action, regardless of their source or the personal relationships involved.